The First Amendment is the right to assemble and express a person's views through protest. However, on May 4th, 1970, the Ohio National Guard would completely disregard the Constitution, in what we know as today as the Kent State Massacre. Some call it an incident, however, I believe that vastly overshadows what actually happened. We'll first have to start with some context. This is going to be Vietnam, anti-war movements, and President Nixon. The Vietnam War went from 1955 to 1975 and caused massive problems within the United States, spawning many different types of anti-war movements. One of the first of many groups of people to begin protesting the war were college students, across numerous college campuses, with some people from the so-called hippie movement joining in. These anti-war movements were around the 1960s, so we had already been in Vietnam for a little. But the domino effect, in which if one country falls to communists means another will soon, led to mass escalations by the US with their involvement in the war. This includes things like drafts, where it was young college men who were the main target for the drafts to be sent to Vietnam, usually coming home altered. However, I want to take the time to point out that many people did actually support the war. These people look down on these anti-war movements, and especially draft dodgers. Draft dodging is when you flee the country to escape being drafted to the war. However, public feelings did shift a little bit in 1967, for multiple reasons.
9 Catholic priests, now known as the Catonsville Nine, broke into a local draft board office in Catonsville, Maryland, stealing 378 draft notices, burning them in a soup of homemade napalm.
By 1967, 500 US troops were in Vietnam. Roughly 15,000 of them were dead, and another 100,000 of them injured. The war expunged $25 billion from the US every year, and the draft system was sending roughly 40,000 young men every month. For the anti-war movement, this is like throwing propane into a bonfire. And when protesting, many people were arrested after collisions with soldiers and US Marshals. Martin Luther King Jr. was a pioneer for the civil rights movement, but he was also exponential in the anti-war movement, as he had pointed out how disproportionate the number of black casualties there were compared to the number of total casualties. In 1968, the public feeling against the war was much more against it, with Vietnam veterans joining anti-war movements, usually in crutches or wheelchairs. Nixon would be appointed president on one of many vows to end the Vietnam War, but he also said he'll restore, quote, law and order in response to the anti-war movements and the riots after Martin Luther King Jr. was assassinated. Nixon would also go on to state that the anti-war movement was actually small, claiming it was a small minority, and that Americans actually supported the war, which is why so many Americans ran to Canada during this time. That's all to say Nixon wasn't helping with the anti-war movement. However, he did actually get roughly 115,000 soldiers back home from Vietnam, which is awesome and part of his campaign promise, until April 30th of 1970. He said we're going right back, publicly justifying his striking of Cambodia.
The possibility of winning a just peace in Vietnam and in the Pacific is at stake.
He had already authorized the movements 2 days prior on April 28th. Now, while Cambodia did ask for assistance from America, the anti-war movement in America was loud and prevalent, no matter how much Nixon wanted to deny it. It was obvious that the American people who could fight didn't want to keep fighting or get sent to go fight. So when Nixon said we're running it back, many college students protested. I mean, these young college kids had to watch their friends and brothers be sent to Vietnam only to never come back or come back totally altered. Which takes us to Kent State University. By the way, that was like war, anti-war movements, civil rights movements, and presidential elections that I quickly skimmed over. I want to talk about the massacre at Kent State, but it's good to know the tension between the public and the government. Well, more specifically, college kids and the government. My sources are linked in the description below if you want to go into further detail about anything I just mentioned. On May 1st, 1970, peaceful protests would be sparked at Kent State University. These protests were spawned by Nixon's address on April 30th. Justifying why he sent troops into Cambodia. In Kent State University, peaceful but passionate protests would go on, occurring in the grassy area in the middle of campus. Later that evening, protesters would go down to the local bars. However, protesters would soon clash with local police. Bonfires would be lit, businesses would be damaged, and some cops would be hit with sticks and rocks. This led to the bars shutting down early, which only caused the protesters to be even more angry. Yet the police were able to disperse the crowd using tear gas, and such was the end of first days of protesting at Kent State. Well, when it comes to the massacre. On the second day, May 2nd, 1970, Mayor Leroy Satrum officially called Governor Rhodes for the Ohio National Guard due to mass rumors of radical activity. Protesters had gathered at the ROTC building, which some began to set ablaze to. The burning of the building caused fire trucks to show up, and when they tried to help out, protesters would slash or grab at the hoses. Only some National Guard would show up to disperse the crowd, but this incident only validated the mayor's beliefs even more, and much more firepower was soon to take over Kent State University. On May 3rd, 1970 at Kent State University, motivated by the governor and the mayor's mentality of order and law, roughly 1,000 Ohio National Guards would show up to the university. Mayor Satrum and Governor Rhodes headed out for these protesters. They were literally saying these college kids were worse than brown shirts. Brown shirts are, which I don't know if I can say that, so Yahtzees. There was supposed to be a meeting on this day between students and officials. However, that would never come because officials would not show up. This led to the students blocking off roadways. Soon confrontations between students and officials escalated, and the riot act was read. The riot act is pretty much just a vicious warning saying you need to stop doing what you're doing. These confrontations led to violence with both sides being injured. But mind you, the guards had rifles fixed with bayonets. The students had sticks, stones, and bottles and stuff. On Monday, May 4th, 1970, many students at Kent State University went on with their days as usual, trying to get to class, with another group of students protesting the Vietnam War, with even more cheering them on. Although the university did ban this protest after the prior 3 days of protests, Governor Rhodes attempted to get a court-ordered state of emergency at Kent State due to fears of radical members sought out to destroy the university, but he failed to get that order. This didn't stop him from sending in more than 100 guardsmen to disperse the group of students that were protesting that day. These guardsmen broke into two groups to attempt to break up the crowd. General Robert Canterbury was the one who led the armed forces against the unarmed students, and gave orders to protesters to leave the area. When this was met with chants of solidarity and insults thrown at the police officers, the guardsmen launched tear gas and began marching towards protesters with bayonets ready. Chaos then ensued, with an armed militia coming down on students who could only throw back rocks, sticks, and tear gas that was thrown at them. At one point, a group of guardsmen knelt down and proceeded to aim at a group of protesters, as if they were a firing squad, trying to scare the protesters. However, this group didn't fire just yet. The armed militia tactic worked, but the boys with gas masks and heavy artillery still felt threatened by protesting college students. And as a group of these National Guards elevated a hill, supposedly one of them heard a sniper rifle go off. Within the next 13 seconds, 28 armed guards shot between 61 and 67 bullets. Within that 13 seconds, the National Guard had managed to kill 4 students, injured 9 others, paralyzed one of the injured, and engulfed the country into further division. There had been 3 days of protest before this. While there was violence and damage to local stores, there was absolutely no mention of any of the protesters having any sort of firearm, other than the rumors the governor and the mayor acted upon. Again, rumors. 2 of the casualties were protesters, but the National Guard also killed 2 other students who were just on their way to class. Even if the authorities were allowed to impede on the First Amendment, using deadly force, they still killed 2 people completely unrelated to the protests. But let's not forget, none of the casualties or injuries were justified by any means. After the National Guard fired at unarmed civilians, it took a professor from the university to calm things down. The students were ready to take on the National Guard, which would have just led to more casualties. Again, faculty was the ones who calmed things down. The victims of the slaughter that took place at Kent State University are Jeffrey Miller. He was 20 and regarded as very intelligent by his brother. He would be the victim of this famous photo, in which Mary Ann Vecchio knelt over him. Allison Cross. She was 19. She was known to be loving and caring. Famously, she put flowers on the barrels of the guns during the protest and say, quote, "Flowers are better than bullets." William Schroeder. He was 20 and let his parents know he wasn't taking any part of the protests. He most certainly questioned why he and his peers were being sent to war, but wanted to avoid all danger. He was extremely smart and into history, as well as being a part of the ROTC at Kent State. He was on his way to class when he was killed. Sanda Schroeder. She was 20 and was known to be incredibly funny, an honor student who would help out others in the clinic with their speech impediments, hoping one day to help stroke victims find their voices again. She was killed while walking to class. Jeffrey Miller would be the only one to die instantly. 9 other students would be injured from the gunfire from the National Guard. Dean Caller, who had been injured, was also paralyzed from his wounds. The Kent State Massacre wouldn't be the only time the Ohio National Guard shot college protesters. In fact, 11 days later, they would do it again. On May 15, 1970, the Ohio National Guard would shoot and kill more protesters at Jackson State State College. Protests have been going on to the escalation in the U.S. involvement in the Vietnam War, civil rights, and fighting racism and repression, as well as the inclusion of women and minorities in the educational system. On top of that, not even 2 weeks prior, 4 college students were murdered, and 9 others wounded at Kent State by officials due to protest and violent outbursts. These outbursts as in lighting fires, destruction of property, and blocking traffic. Nothing that warrants the National Guard blindly firing into a crowd. At Jackson State College, the protests were mainly focused around the racial issues between the white residents of Jackson, Mississippi, and the black college students at Jackson State College. And imagine every stereotypical racist thing a white person would do in 1970s to a black person. That was what was going on. To elaborate further, there's a road called Lynch Street that runs right next to Jackson State College. I'm going to say that again. A college prominently attended by black students is next to a road called Lynch Street, and the white residents would harass the students non-stop. Some instances reported drivers trying to run over students, with one actually getting hit. Others throwing bottles and racial slurs towards the students, just trying to get to class. All the horrible shit racists do, they were doing it. Hence the protests at Jackson State College. These protests were going on for months though. But on the night of May 14th, 1970, no protests were going on. However, there was some random dump truck parked in the middle of Lynch Street, which was set on fire by some unknown accomplice. So someone committed arson. What did the Ohio police do? Well, they decked themselves out in full riot gear. Getting to the college around midnight, someone with a sniper rifle had shot at them from the 4th floor of the women's dormitory at Jackson State College. This was later debunked. It was actually someone throwing a bottle in it, hitting and breaking. Nonetheless, the police would fire around 400 rounds at the building, Alexander Hall. 2 young men were murdered, 12 others were wounded by the rounds, and even more were injured by shrapnel and glass flying through the building. What's weird is the bullets hit everything, including people on the street, even though the police said that the sniper came from 4 stories above. But again, that excuse was debunked, and there were hundreds of witnesses. So you would think that might help get some sort of justice? Not at all. None of the officers were arrested for this. And when the victim's family tried to sue, the cases were just dismissed. The main impact the massacre had was just the college being shut down. And the 1970 graduating class from Jackson State College wouldn't be allowed to graduate. In fact, they only graduated recently in 2021. However, later in 2019, under the Emmett Till Unsolved Rights Crime Act, Gibbs and Green, the victims, we'll go more in depth about these young men in a second. They appeared on the list of names of cold cases opened by the federal government. So that is a glimmer of hope. At the time of this recording, the case is still open. When the Ohio National Guard unjustly shot 400 rounds into Alexander Hall at Jackson State College on May 15, 1970, they would kill Philip Gibbs. Philip Gibbs would graduate near the top of his high school class in 1967, and he would enter Jackson State for pre-law studies. He was also married to his high school sweetheart, Dell Adams, and they had a young son named Gibbs Jr. Philip Gibbs was in his junior year of college, walking on the street opposite the Ohio National Guard. That's when the authorities murdered him. He was 21. Philip Gibbs never got to meet Demetrius Gibbs, his and Dell's second son. The second person the Ohio National Guard murdered was James Green. James Green was one of 8 siblings and excelled at track. He would also step up and get a job to help out his mother, who had been widowed, after James' father passed away when he was young. He was only in high school doing all of this, and had dreams to attend UCLA. However, on the night of May 15th, he would be walking home from work when the Ohio National Guard began firing at Alexander Hall at Jackson State College, the nearby college James had grown up with. James's dreams of attending UCLA were cut short. James was 18 when he was murdered. This is an extreme gloss over of the Jackson State College, and I'll probably make its own video giving the respect it deserves. I was completely unaware of this until I researched into Kent State, and then I found this, which kind of mirrors what happened back in the day with the media. The Jackson State College massacre was highly swept under the rug by the media. After the Jackson State shooting that happened only 11 days after the Kent State massacre, Nixon would enact the President's Commission on Campus Unrest, which is pretty much just them investigating themselves. And through that, no arrests were made, although they did say that the use of live ammo in firing was unwarranted, stating that unconfirmed sniper fire shouldn't warrant a hail of bullets on an unarmed crowd, also going on to say that it was an unjustified overreaction. Again, no arrests were made. And even worse, a shit ton of people thought that the police did the right thing. Or, and I quote, the protesters got what they deserved. I wonder what they think about the students who weren't protesting who were killed. But there was a good amount of people who supported the war. This was called the silent majority.
The great silent majority of my fellow Americans, I ask for your support. For the more divided we are at home, the less likely the enemy is to negotiate at Paris. Let us be united for peace.
This isn't to say that the Kent State University massacre didn't alter a lot of people's minds. The Jackson State massacre was more swept under the rug, which is why it didn't get as much coverage. There was a good division of people who were pro-war and anti-war. The Life magazine and all other sorts of publicity became heavy against the Vietnam War. And 3 years after these massacres, the US would pull out of Vietnam. and then 1 year later, Nixon was forced to resign.
But as president, I must put the interests of America first.
So that's good. But again, no consequences came from the unwarranted shooting at Kent State and Jackson State. If we choose to ignore or justify our bad history, then we are bound to repeat it. I think now is the perfect time to go over the massacre that took place after the National Guard was called in for college protesters.
Enjoy your free speech.
Alright, so that was a heavier topic, but like I said, I think it's important to talk about this, especially now. I know my last video got some exposure and we got some new people in our boat. I just wanted to say welcome. To my returning viewers, it's always nice to see you. And lastly, thank you all for watching. Alright.